New information has come out on just how insanely corrupt Ukraine is.
This morning, Ukraine's government is in the midst of a purge.
That is because of this scandal in the defense ministry.
So what we're seeing here is the Ukrainian government cleaning house.
We're sending them billions of dollars, and corrupt Ukrainian officials are blowing it on lavish vacations, private jets, luxury cars, yachts, clothes. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, America has sent nearly $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. That's more than America gave Afghanistan's military over the span of 20 years, and more than 3 times the aid it sent to South Vietnam between 1959 and 1975. But not all of that money has made it to the people who actually need it. Thanks to Ukraine being one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, that money has ended up in the hands of Ukrainian oligarchs. Ah yes, not only does Russia have oligarchs, but so does Ukraine. And they've been spending America's billions on a lot of other things aside from defense and the economy. And yet, no one is allowed to talk about this.
Several senior officials, including the deputy defense minister, have resigned.
President Zelenskyy, elected on a pledge to crack down on corruption, removed a number of key government figures accused of misusing their positions for their own gain.
See, before the war in Ukraine started, the news had a lot to say about just how corrupt and backwards Ukraine really was.
These days, the corruption in Ukraine is all over the news.
He was the president of Georgia, then a governor in Ukraine, and now he's in jail.
Are allegations of corruption that stretch all the way back to Panama.
But once Russia invaded, all of that disappeared. Now don't get me wrong, the invasion is clearly wrong. Russia is clearly at fault here. But doesn't 1/10 of $1 trillion in aid call for at least a little bit of accountability? Since it is money coming out of your pocket into the hands of the American government in the form of taxes, and then off to Ukraine? Stay dangerous, and this is the insane corruption happening right now in Ukraine.
President Zelenskyy, elected on a pledge to crack down on corruption, removed a number of key government figures accused of misusing their positions.
Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. But here's the thing about living under a Soviet dictator for almost 70 years. People started forgetting what it takes to run a country on their own. And that's exactly what happened to Ukraine. When it officially split from the Soviet Union, it was left with a massive power vacuum. It needed a president, a constitution, laws, courts, a working government. And that stuff doesn't just appear out of thin air overnight. So who stepped up to the plate to guide Ukraine to its new independent future? The same powerful families and businesses that thrived during Ukraine's Soviet years. And suddenly, corruption became a core part of how the new country was run. Ukraine became the Wild West of Eastern Europe. Things like bribery, putting family members in positions of power, backdoor deals, these things weren't the exception. They weren't crimes. They weren't forced upon the Ukrainian government. They were fundamental to how the government functioned. It's crazy to think about this if you live in the West, but this is how most small countries operate. In America, if a government official is caught bribing his way into his position, everyone is all up in arms. But in Ukraine, bribes and favors from powerful friends was the only way to get into office. Nothing could get done without greasing the right palms and scratching the right backs. But here's the thing about corruption. As much as it was part of everyday life in Ukraine, it was tapping the country dry of all its resources. Like when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, and none of the country's security forces had the money, equipment, or training it needed to stop it. And it was all thanks to decades of Ukrainian oligarchs siphoning money away from its intended uses. By 2014, Ukraine and the rest of the world realized it had a massive problem on its hands. How could Ukraine ever dream of becoming part of NATO or the EU if it couldn't even control its own governments? And as much as Ukraine's leadership made a big show of rooting out corruption, things just went from bad to worse. For more than 30 years, Ukraine did very little to stop the corruption in the government. The only real step it took towards rooting out corrupt businesses was a public procurement system called Prozoro. And sure, Prozoro probably did help make running a business fairer and easier, but it didn't really do anything about government corruption. So government corruption just got worse and worse. One man in charge of regional transportation in Ukraine took bribes in exchange for allocating minibus routes to certain companies and drivers. He drove a sports car even though his salary was only around $170 a month. When people found out what he was doing, he was fired. But then he quickly got another job doing the exact same thing in a different district. And that was just one example on the lower end of the Ukrainian government's food chain. Just this year, it was revealed that the Ministry of Defense's head of procurement had paid $2.7 million for 3,000 bulletproof vests. Turns out the vests weren't very bulletproof, and were quote unable to properly protect Ukrainian soldiers. But that didn't matter. The official got the money for the real bulletproof vests, bought cheaper ones, and had already pocketed the difference. And that's not even the worst of it. One government official took an almost $400,000 bribe to buy overpriced generators, while most of Ukraine doesn't have access to a stable power supply, while the Ministry of Defense signed off on contracts to supply its troops with food that costs 2 to 3 times the regular price. And these are just a few examples that we know of. And how are these Ukrainian cronies enjoying all this American money they're getting? They use cars meant for humanitarian purposes to go on business trips. They use aid money to take luxury vacations overseas, to buy property, sports cars. They bought hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, designer clothes, and luxury gold watches. But no matter how much Ukrainian corruption was being exposed, the government refused to do anything about it. In 2016, Ukraine's ex-president even accused anyone reporting on Ukrainian corruption as siding with Russia. It's Russian propaganda, hello! Which is a tactic that America has gladly taken a page out of. President Biden has called the war, quote, a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force, end quotes. When in reality, America has a ton of other ulterior motives for supporting Ukraine. It's the perfect excuse to overthrow Putin. It's the perfect time to get Europe away from Russian natural gas and have them switch over to American natural gas, like what former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has admitted to.
Over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence.
It's also a great way to test America's ability to mobilize military equipment for war. It's very profitable for the military-industrial complex. Reconstructing Ukraine would be very profitable for firms like BlackRock. It will open up Ukraine even more to American corporations once it's over. And it's because of all these reasons that America needs to do whatever it takes to maintain Ukraine's appearance as a faultless victim that we need to keep sending money to. It's why this is probably the first time you're hearing about a lot of this stuff. It's why anyone who tries to report on corruption in Ukraine or the misuse of American aid is anti-democratic or siding with Russia.
Hey, when we got into this, what you sold to the American people was you were going to provide defensive weapons only, so Ukraine could defend itself. Now we're sending tanks. Now we're sending, it just came out, longer range missiles. These were things that were totally off the table. And then suddenly, step by step by step, not only are they on the table, but you're not allowed to question it. You're not allowed to say, hey guys, are we setting ourselves up for World War III here? Which is something the president himself was talking about not very long ago, because we are talking about a nuclear armed superpower that we are engaged in a proxy war with. And you're basically not allowed to say, hey, how does this end?
But now the truth is starting to come out. Ukrainian anti-corruption activists have been digging up dirt the government have been trying to hide. These activists are risking everything to publish reports on corruption, even though they know criticizing the Ukrainian government during wartime could get them in real trouble. And so far, their efforts have been paying off. In the past few months, some of Ukraine's most important officials have either resigned or Zelenskyy has had to fire them over corruption charges. The end goal of America is clear. America wants to open up Ukraine for business, so that American corporations can come in and siphon the country dry, just like what America has done with other countries time and time again. And one of the last countries they did this to was Iraq. In fact, here's Hillary Clinton admitting that Iraq was a literal business opportunity.
And so it's time for the United States to start thinking of Iraq as a business opportunity.
They don't even try to hide these things. I was gonna cover the story in a normal video, but then I remembered that anything about Iraq or the wars in the Middle East get instantly demonetized. So we're gonna be releasing this video in the next few weeks as a private documentary available to only members of this channel. All you have to do to be the first to watch is by clicking that join button below. Remember, these private documentaries are never gonna be released anywhere else. It's all the videos I wish I could make on climate change, CIA torture programs, profiting off of Iraq. So while you're waiting for this Iraq one to be released, you can enjoy all the other ones we've released already. And if you want more videos like this that are longer and even more controversial, make sure you hit that subscribe button above. This is where we post private documentaries that are too controversial to be posted publicly around once every month or so. We've got one on MKUltra, the CIA's super disturbing mind control experiments. We've got one on Monsanto, the company that owns the world's food supply. We've got one on how Dick Cheney made an insane amount of wealth off of the Iraq war, and many, many more. These private documentaries are basically like these videos but turned up to 11, and you are gonna love them. So click that subscribe button to watch now.